This next lecture is going to center around phylogenetics, and it's a great lead-in to talking about the evolution of different primate species, including hominid ancestors as well as non-human primates. So we're going to go through some of the basics of how new species form. Now, taxonomy is a word you've heard before. It means the science of classifying things. Linnaeus is sort of the father of that science. If we look here, we can see a basic classification system for primates. We start up at the top here with the animal kingdom. We go into the chordate phylum, into the vertebra or vertebrata, which is meaning of vertebrate, subphylum, into the mammal class, the placental mammal subclass, the primate order, and then we see our two suborders, Anthropoidea and Prosimii. Now we also know now that we are more looking at that in terms of haplorhines and streplorhines, but that's okay. And then we see our basic groups listed down here at the bottom. So this is sort of what taxonomy looks like. Now the way that we classify organisms is based on their features. A lot of times what we're looking for are what are the similarities that they have with each other, and are those similarities derived from a common ancestor, or are they new traits that show up and aren't from a common ancestor? When a trait comes from a common ancestor, we call it a homologous trait or a homology. An example would be the front limb, so the upper arm, the lower arm, and the hands in all animals that basically have vertebrae. So frogs, lizards, birds, humans, dogs, dolphins, we all have the same basic bones, even though they have very different functions now. So the current function is not so important to homology. What's important is the ancestry. On the other hand, we have analogous traits or analogies. These are traits that have the same function but developed independently, so they're not the result of common descent. An example would be like the wings of various species. So an insect wing, a reptile wing, a bird wing, a bat wing. The wings themselves are not analogies, but in the case of the reptile wing, the bird wing, and the bat wing, if we talked about the arm bones, those could be homologous traits, but the wings themselves have the same function but evolved independently, so we call them analogies. In terms of how those analogous traits can evolve, we call those processes homoplasy, or we can refer to them as homoplastic traits. Now, the two basic mechanisms of homoplasy are convergent evolution and parallel evolution. Here on the left we have some examples of the convergent evolution of placental and marsupial mammals. And what you see here is the marsupial mammals that live in Australia are very similar in terms of where they fit into the environment and their physical traits to the placental mammals that live throughout the rest of the world. However, they have a big difference of being a marsupial, which means they're pouch carriers, as opposed to placentals, which give live birth and have the use of a placenta so that the babies are more developed when they come out. So you can see the difference here between a placental wolf and a Tasmanian wolf, an ocelot and a native cat, a flying squirrel versus a flying phalanger, a groundhog versus a wombat. Quite a few examples. Convergent evolution, in terms of a mechanism, means starting in different environments in different places, but eventually becoming more similar to each other over time as those environments become more similar. Parallel evolution, on the other hand, is where you have two environments that are already similar to each other but are separated from each other, and so individual animals evolve in parallel to each other along the same basic path even though they're not related to each other. Now, one of the ways that we can represent all of these traits and all of these classifications that we're coming up with is in a cladogram. A cladogram is based on shared derived traits. That means traits that are new or different from the ancestor and shared in a small group. In fact, when they do share a trait, we can know that they shared a branching event together. So for example, here we have amphibians, mammals, reptiles, dinosaurs, theropods, and birds. Theropods and birds are put together because they both share wings. So that's their branching event. You'll notice though here there's no time element. We don't see any of the animals that are extinct, and we don't see when these different animals show up in the fossil record. In order to look at that, we would have to look at a phylogenetic tree. This is going to show the evolutionary relationships and all the extinct species with a time element. So here we have the same basic animals on the right over here, but what you'll see is based on where the labels are and where the branching events occur, you know approximately when they evolved, and you can see all these little branches that don't reach the top, indicating that they are extinct groups of animals. Now, in terms of the traits that we're using to define them, we look for primitive or ancestral traits. These are going to be the traits that are inherited from a common ancestor, and so they're shared among all the descendants of that ancestor. We looked for derived or modified traits, which means they're modified from the ancestral condition. And then if they're shared derived traits, they let us know that those species share a branching event together, like what I just showed you. So let's look at some examples of this. In this cladogram, we can see ancestral features as well as derived features. So for example, right here, the lungfish and the crocodile, they both have no hair and they have a tail. So those are going to be our ancestral traits. When we move up to the monkey, we still have the ancestral trait of tail, but now we have hair. So this is going to be a new or derived trait. Now whether it's shared derived depends on whether the animal coming after it has it. And it does. Apes and humans have hair. So hair is a shared derived trait among apes, monkeys, and humans. Then the loss of a tail becomes another shared derived trait only between apes and humans. So you can see they branch together separately from where the monkey branched. I'm not going to require you to be able to reproduce this branching. I just want you to understand the difference between the types of traits. Here's an example without using actual animals. If we look at the most recent generation of these three organisms that have these specific traits, so we see our green hexagons, red circles, pink squares, and so on. One thing that I notice is that they all share the green hexagons, and two of them share the pink squares. So I'm going to guess that those are coming from an ancestor. So let's look at their ancestors. And what we see is the animal that was ancestral to all of them had the green hexagon. So that's going to be our ancestral trait. Here, the pink squares became a derived trait. And then they became a shared derived trait among the ancestors B and C of this individual on this generation right here. Take some time to look this over and make sure this makes sense to you. Now, in terms of putting groups together or separating groups, the smallest group that we recognize in science of organisms is the species. And the definition of the species is based on a couple of different things. One definition is called the biological species concept. This was developed by John Ray, which you heard about in earlier lectures. These are groups of natural populations, so meaning populations that occur in nature, that are capable of fertile interbreeding and producing reproductive offspring, but they are reproductively isolated from other such groups. So the key there is that these are natural populations and reproductively isolated. So this isn't going to include animals that we have artificially created hybrids. The ecological species concept, on the other hand, looks at species as a group of organisms that exploit a single niche. Now that niche is the position of that species in their physical and biological environment. So basically, what's their job? Where do they live? Who do they eat? Who eats them? How do they use resources? So sometimes we group animals together based on where they fit in the environment. These are both valid ways of grouping organisms. Now, in terms of how new species form, the process of making new species is called speciation. There's two basic ways that new species can form, and they require reproductive isolation over time. The first kind we're going to talk about is called cladogenesis. A clade is a group and genesis means birth of, so it's the birth of a new group. We start off with a group here that has some variation in it that isn't really isolated. Over time, they experience more isolation, and we'll start to see the ones that are more like B become more different from the ones that are more like A. Eventually, over time, A and B will become completely isolated from each other, and then we'll call them totally different species. Now, sympatric speciation is the result of disruptive selection. So where you have a single population adapting to two or more different environmental regimes, and they progressively pull apart, resulting in speciation. You can also have allopatric speciation, where the group becomes subdivided by a barrier and eventually develops into two species. So there's sort of this artificial reproductive isolation introduced into the group. A good example of this is chimpanzees and bonobos. If you look at their range right here, you'll notice that the bonobos are sort of localized to this area and they butt up against the chimpanzee range, but they don't really overlap with them. Why is that? Well, if we zoom in on that area, what we see is that where the bonobos have evolved, they are separated from the chimps by the Congo River. So you have this isolating barrier resulting in speciation. Here's where an example of cladogenesis. Chimpanzees and bonobos most likely have the same ancestor, but because they became separated, they eventually became reproductively isolated enough to evolve into two different species. Now, the other type of speciation that we see is called anagenesis. This is where you see an entire species change over time. So, for example, species A turns into what we would call species B. An example of this would be, let's say you have a group of relatively small rodents, and over thousands and thousands of years, selection favors the big rodents. So you end up finding a rodent that's, instead of the size of a rat, is now the size of a house cat. It's possible that you could decide to classify them as a different species than their ancestors, even though they are the result of that whole group turning over. Now, when we see a lot of different species show up at the same time, we call this adaptive radiation. So it's a rapid expansion and diversification of life forms into new ecological niches. A good example of this is after an extinction event, all of a sudden it's like all these niches or job openings open up, and so you see animals and other organisms evolve rapidly and take over those niches. So adaptive radiation is something that we see relatively frequently throughout the fossil record. Now, if we look at how organisms can change over time, there's sort of two views about how evolutionary change occur. One is called gradualism, and it assumes that over time, evolution occurs at a gradual, constant rate. So you might see species 1, and then 2, and then 3. Punctuated equilibrium, on the other hand, assumes that there's periods of rapid change and periods of stability. Rapid change, stability. Rapid change, stability. So it's more like a staircase. Now, as it turns out, it doesn't appear that either one of these is 100% correct or 100% wrong. If we look in the fossil record, we can find evidence to support both models. So it probably just depends on what time period you're looking at and what group of organisms you're looking at. Now, since we have an idea of how species form, let's look at a very basic geological history of the planet in terms of what the different time periods are and who was around when. This is going to give us a great introduction into talking about when different primates evolved. It'll give us our background. If we look at the history of vertebrate evolution, we know that the birth of the Earth is right around 4.5 billion years ago. We don't even see any signs of life till 3.5 billion years ago. So for the first billion years, it is quiet on the planet. Okay? We don't see any first vertebrates until we're in the Paleozoic era, right here, the Paleozoic era. At around 500 million years ago, we start to see our first vertebrates in the Cambrian period. As we move out of the Paleozoic into the Mesozoic, this is where we see sort of the age of the reptiles, the Jurassic period, the Cretaceous period. We start to see placental mammals right at the end of the Cretaceous period. Then we have a large extinction event and we enter into the Cenozoic era. That's where we're going to be interested in for our primates. So again, here we have our Paleozoic, first signs of life, reptiles, major extinction, then we have reptiles with dinosaurs, placental mammals start to appear in the Cretaceous, and then a major extinction. So where we're going to start looking at primates is going to start right at around that 65 million year ago mark. Now the Cenozoic is divided into two periods. And by the way, you can pronounce that Cenozoic as well. It's divided into the Tertiary period and the Quaternary period. Now those two periods are then divided up into 7 epochs. The first 5 epochs are in the Tertiary period. The last 2 epochs, or the most recent 2 epochs, are in the Quaternary period. The Paleocene epoch is from 65 to 55 million years ago and is notable because it's when early placental mammals really started to take over. It's not until the Eocene that we see our first two true primates in the forms of prosimians between 55 and 35 million years ago. In the Oligocene, we see our first monkeys between 23 and 34 million years ago. And the Miocene is known as the age of the apes, or the hominoids, because we see apes in much greater numbers than monkeys, which is the exact opposite of what we see today. Then the Pliocene starts at 5 million years ago, and this is when we see our first truly bipedal, walking on two legs, hominids from the genus Australopithecus. Around 2 million years ago, during the Pleistocene, we see our first genus Homo hominids show up. And the Pleistocene epoch continues until 10,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. Then we enter what used to be called the Holocene, but is now often referred to as the Anthropocene, which is 10,000 years ago to present. So that's the epoch that we are currently in right now. You should be familiar with these in terms of their order and in terms of what they're significant for, but I'm not so concerned that you know every single date. The last thing that's really important to understand with all of this geological history, and as we start to talk about how species form and what's the distribution of different groups that we see today, is to have a very basic understanding of plate tectonics and continental drift. Millions of years ago, all the land on the Earth was connected to itself in one supercontinent called Pangaea. By the Mesozoic, 125 million years ago, it had split into two continents called Laurasia and Gondwanaland. By the Cenozoic, at 65 million years ago, we start to see the continents more similarly to the way that we see them today. We see South America, North America, but it's still attached to Eurasia, Africa, Antarctica, and Australia. India has not yet connected with Asia. So what we see is these plates that the continents are on in the Earth's crust, the plates keep moving and shifting and bumping into each other. In fact, when India eventually bumps into Asia right here, it forms the Himalayan mountains. That's where we get Mount Everest. And eventually, as you know, North America and Eurasia split apart. So the reason that I'm showing you this is so that you can keep in mind that the planet didn't always look the way that it does today. And the continents are always shifting and moving. So in terms of one animal getting to another continent, the distances between the continents were not the same then as they are now. Just keep that in mind as we start talking about where the different animals are coming.